Saturday, April 27th, 2019, Maneco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. This morning I want to talk about the Great Depression in the 30s, the Great Recession as they called it after the crisis of '08, and how, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many scholars, economic scholars, especially from the Austrian school, free market and capitalism weren't to blame for those crises. If anything, those crises were created and accentuated by government, big government, central banking. Central banking, of course, is a state-created monopoly. And I'm going to quickly look through a book I read many years ago, and I highly recommend it. It's fairly academic, but still, still readable by people who are not into economics. Anyone can read it. And it's called America's Great Depression by Murray Rothbard of the Austrian School of Economics. So I'll go into this a little later. Before that, I just want to have a quick look at what happened to the Commitment of Traders report for gold in the last week. I touched upon the previous week that there was a massive net increase of about 54,000 net long positions for gold futures on COMEX by the commercials or the bullion banks. So I wanted to see what happened yesterday. This report's come out around 8:30 p.m. London on Friday, and it's for the period ending on Tuesday this week, this past week. So I wanted to see, if the short covering has continued, and it has. As you can see here, the gold futures commercials decreased their shorts by another 12,333 and increased their longs by 8,701. So net, that was a 21,000 increase in net longs. It's less than the 54,000, but it's still significant. So that's about 75,000, which I would say is significant. So it looks like even though gold was hit hard earlier last week, and it traded below 1270. I think things are starting to look better for gold. We closed yesterday, of course, around 1286. I think the high was around 12. Let's have a look here where the high was. But it was a good day for both gold and silver. The high was around 1288.50. So we had a very good day. And I'll show you the daily chart here. I guess we're still in this falling wedge. Some people could say it's forming, how can I say, head and shoulders top, or we could say it's forming a teacup, and the falling wedge is a handle. Who knows? Let's have a quick look at the weekly chart. Weekly chart, of course, also has the falling wedge. But it's looking, it's in the weekly chart that you can see that it looks like it's a teacup and handle formation. We'll have to see. I remember this kind of formation back in about 2002, end of 2002, 2003, when gold was, just below $330 an ounce, which at the time was a key level, I think 338. And then towards the end of the year, 2002, it actually went almost up to 400. And I remember looking at it, and it looks pretty much similar to that formation back then, as you can see here. The other thing I wanted to just touch upon before I look into the Great Depression and Murray Rothbard's book is the gold-silver ratio, and still very elevated, which means silver is undervalued. I still think silver is a steal, so I would keep stacking. I'm going to add on to my physical silver position probably next week. Not that much, but some extra fiat that I've got. I'm gonna buy some silver coins I was thinking of maybe exchanging some of my gold for silver. I might still do that, but I still want to keep hold of my gold, so I actually just want to exchange fiat for silver. As you can see here, this is at very elevated levels. Going back 30 years, we are at very high levels here in the gold-silver ratio. So yeah, that's what I've been thinking about lately. So just before I go into the book, just take a sip of some coffee here from my End the Fed mug. You can get this mug. I designed that Maneco 64 here, End the Fed mug, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. So it says actually here, United States Federal Reserve System, robbing Americans since 1913, and the Fed, right? So yeah, you can get one of these from the Teespring store, Maneco 64. Details are below in the description. And there's some other merchandise there if you're interested. It helps a little bit the channel. I make a small profit on it. So just take a sip. You don't realize when you do videos, if it's a long video, that your throat gets very dry and you need a drink sometimes, especially live streams that can go on sometimes for an hour. So anyway, the Great Depression and the misconception, and which is mainly a Keynesian misconception and a misconception of the globalists. I wouldn't even say misconception. They've used it as an excuse to enlarge the size of government, to control society even more through central banking. As we know, that old saying, give me control of the money supply, Mr. Rothschild said, and I care not who makes the laws. So it's not free market capitalism that has taken us to where we are right now with insurmountable fiat money debt, rising inequality. It's not free market and the rule of law and small government that has done that. But they try to, with the left-right paradigm, they try to brainwash people, and they do a very good job, because most people on the left now think we have too much free market, too much small government, even though taxation is like 40 to 50% of GDP in the US and Western Europe. I mean, in France is above 50%. No wonder, people are getting sick and tired of it, and the yellow vests have caught on. Even though most of them actually want more socialism, which is sad. So that's why I want to talk about this, because the other fallacy that they use to blame the Great Depression on is the fact that we were on a gold standard back then, right? They say, oh, there's not enough gold, we're on a gold standard, that's why gold doesn't work. But Murray Rothbard, he's of the Austrian school. He was of the Austrian School of Economics. He dispels that with his book. So I'll go over a little bit here from the inside jacket of the book. This is from the introduction by Paul Johnson. And this is what he says. The Wall Street collapse and the Great Depression, which followed it, were among the most important events of the 20th century. By undermining confidence in the efficacy of the market and the capitalist system, they helped explain why the absurdly inefficient and murderous system of Soviet communism survived for so long. For half a century, the conventional orthodox explanation provided by John Maynard Keynes and his followers was that capitalism was incapable of saving itself, and that government did little to rescue an intellectually bankrupt market system from the consequences of its own folly. Rothbard produced in 1963 his own explanation, which turned the conventional one on its head. The severity of the Wall Street crash, he argued, was not due to the unrestrained license of freebooting capitalist system, but to government insistence on keeping a boom going artificially by pumping in inflationary credit. His book is an intellectual tour de force. It has stood the test of time with success, even panache. So, of course, I won't go through the whole book, but what he shows is that, in a broad sense, is that after World War I, you know, when the Fed had just been created, right? 1913, started operating in 1914. And the Americans, through the Fed, were a huge engine of finance for World War I. Many people argue if the Fed wasn't around and the Americans hadn't come into World War I in 1917, that war would have ended because they were running out of money. So the Fed provided liquidity. World War I. The other thing it started doing was expanding its balance sheet even more, something I've spoken about, the history of the Fed's balance sheet. It started discounting government securities. Before World War I started, they could only really discount commercial loans. So the war was an excuse for the creation of credit, the increase of the Fed's balance sheet, getting away from the discipline of gold already. And then the warring factions, especially Britain, even though it had won the war, had to go back on the gold standard. But they went back on the gold standard in the 1926, at the same rate they were before World War I. And they couldn't, they just issued too much paper money to go back at the same rate. So it was a deflationary rate they went back to, but what they should have done is gone at a higher rate to the pound. And guess who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer then, or the Finance Minister, or Treasury Secretary equivalent in the UK? Well, it was Winston Churchill. And what's that got to do with the Wall Street boom and the bust of the Great Depression? Well, the New York Fed and the Bank of England work very closely together. You know, they're controlled and owned by the same people. So the Federal Reserve kept monetary policy very loose, especially after 1926, when the UK went back on the gold standard at a rate that wasn't the correct one. So, and the New York Fed did that in order to keep the gold from flowing out of the UK. And what that did, of course, was ignite a stock market bubble and the roaring 20s. So it's got nothing to do with free market. You know, if we hadn't had the Federal Reserve helping another central bank, which is not a market institution, we wouldn't have had that boom. And also World War I, we wouldn't have had that. So this is basically, there's a lot more in here that you need to read, of course. But Murray Rothbard totally dispels the notion that it was because of a gold standard that there was, a Great Depression. But it wasn't. It was the easy money and the interference in the free market by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, or the Federal Reserve, and the Bank of England, war as well. I'll just go through the conclusion here on page 336. It says, the lessons of Mr. Hoover's record. Many people think that Hoover was a laissez-faire guy, and that it was Roosevelt who came in 33 and changed that. But that's not true at all. So let's read this. Mr. Hoover met the challenge of the Great Depression by acting quickly and decisively, indeed almost continuously throughout his term of office, putting into effect the greatest program of offense and defense, apparently that was a quote he used, against depression ever attempted in America. Bravely, he used every modern economic tool, every device of progressive and enlightened economics, every facet of government planning to combat the Depression. For the first time, laissez-faire was boldly thrown overboard and every governmental weapon thrown into the breach. America had awakened and was now ready to use the state to the hilt, unhampered by the supposed shibboleths of laissez-faire. President Hoover was a bold and audacious leader in this awakening. By every progressive tenet of our day, he should have ended his term a conquering hero. Instead, he left America in utter and complete ruin, a ruin unprecedented in length and intensity. So Rothbard asks the question, what was the trouble? Economic theory demonstrates that only governmental inflation can generate a boom and bust cycle, and that the Depression will be prolonged and aggravated by inflationists and other interventionary measures. Sounds familiar, right? Nowadays, we had the bust of '08, and we've had the inflationary cycle, even though we're told we don't have any inflation. The inflationary cycle has been the QE and the money printing, right? And it hasn't improved anything. It's taken the country to ruin, all the debt it's created. In contrast to the myth of laissez-faire, we have shown in this book how government intervention generated the unsound boom of the 1920s, and how Hoover's new departure aggravated the Great Depression by massive measures of interference. The guilt for the Great Depression must, at long last, be lifted from the shoulders of the free market economy and placed where it properly belongs, at the doors of politicians, bureaucrats, and the mass of enlightened, that's in brackets, enlightened economists. And in any other depression, past or future, the story will be the same. While this book was written in the 60s and is very true, very prescient about the future, this is what we have now. And they can't blame the gold standard or gold now, because we haven't been in a gold standard or in a gold-backed system since 1971. So there you go. Don't let the mainstream economic class, politicians, blame the free market and capitalism for what's happening now. The problem is interference, big government, and central banking. So next time the crisis hits hard, let's try to go back to, no central banks, sound money, small government, and laissez-faire. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. Make sure you hit the little notification bell above to be notified of my new videos. You can follow me on Twitter as well, Steemit, and on DTube. I wish you all a great weekend. Take care. Bye.